We have been discussing about The Nile by John Keats, and we discussed about this particular question. I hope you guys can hear me properly. We have been discussing about the question that is actually highlighting how it appears to the readers. So we actually discussed this particular poem appears to the readers in two different ways, right? So in the octave part, the poet is discussing about the mythical and mystical features related to the river Nile using number of poetic techniques, and the sestate part is dedicated to the reality of the river Nile, where the poet realized the fact that Nile river is not kind of a special river. Whatever the qualities that we can see in any river can be seen in Nile river as well. That is the idea actually given here, right? So last week we discussed about this part where the ninth line we described about the volta line. This is a sonnet. Basically in sonnet we have 14 lines. I explained you in the ninth line we have the shift, right? So we discussed this part last week. The ninth line is the volta line of the sonnet, which separates the octave 8 lines with the regular rhyming scheme from the sestate. So basically we have 14 lines. Octave means first 6 lines, first 8 lines. Sestate means the rest of the 6 lines. So the ninth line can be taken as the volta line, which separates the octave from the sestate. So from the sestate onwards, the poet actually explains about the reality of any river, where the poet says, even though I said that Nile river is a holy river, a special river, kind of a river that we all admire, at the end of the day, poet comes to the conclusion that the reality is there is nothing like that. Poet comes to the conclusion explaining the fact that there is nothing like that. Just like the other rivers, Nile river is also just a normal natural river. Whatever the qualities that we can see in any other river can be seen in Nile river as well. That is what we have discussed, right? So this part we have completed. We are moving to the other part. Where in this particular line, it is ignorance that makes a barren waste of all beyond itself. So in these two lines, we can understand how the poet accepts the fact that he has actually explained about the mythical, mystical features of the river Nile based on what? Based on his ignorance. He clearly accepts the fact that because of my ignorance only, I explained about Nile river like that. But in reality, Nile river is just like a normal natural river, though it is known to be the longest river in the world. There is no specialty in river Nile. That is what the poet tries to explain. The poet remarks, arousing the curiosity of the reader, that there is an infertile waste regardless the earlier emphasized mythical value of all beyond itself, which is caused due to the lack of knowledge. So now it is appealing to us in a realitical manner. Now, what was the question? How it appeals to the readers. Now, readers will understand about the river Nile in two different perspectives. If the reader is reading the octave part, the reader will get some kind of mythical, mystical element about river Nile. The reader will give some kind of speciality to the river Nile. But soon after the octave part, when we start the sestate part, first what will happen? We will understand the reality of the Nile river, where the poet says, Nile river is not a special river. Just like any other river, Nile river also has the same qualities. So there is no speciality at all. So from the sestate onwards, the readers will realize that there is no special quality. The writer or else the poet has actually explained about us, explained about the river Nile to us in a mythical, mystical element or else kind of a historical feature, right? But according to the poet, this is not the reality. This is what we have explained. I hope you guys can see the screen, which is caused due to the lack of knowledge. Now the poet is addressing to the intelligence of the readers. Now the poet is addressing to the intelligent readers, right? The poet is actually addressing to our mind. The beauty, legendary sacredness related to the Nile has been vanished. The poet is evoking the practicality of any river, right? So the poet is actually comparing the Nile river to the other rivers, right? And by that, the poet tries to emphasize the fact that there is no specialty in river Nile. River Nile is also very similar to other rivers as well, right? There is no specialty at all. River Nile is very similar to other rivers. There is no specialty, right? Then the poet says, "Thou dost bedew green Russian like our rivers." So from here onwards, we can understand how the poet is comparing river Nile to the other rivers. whatever the qualities that we can see in other rivers can be also seen in River Nile. So in that method, we can understand in the sestate part, the poet is actually comparing River Nile to the other rivers. In the octave part, what happened, my dear children? The poet tried to show us the special qualities of River Nile. In the sestate part, what happens? The poet says, no, 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 no. I am sorry. River Nile is not special. River Nile is not sacred. River Nile is not kind of a holy river, even though I explained to you that in the octave part, right? In the sestate part, the poet says, River Nile is just like other rivers in the world. River Nile is very similar to the River Thames. River Nile is very similar to River Mahaveli or whatever, right? So there is no special quality. Now from here onwards, we can understand how John Keats actually compares River Nile to the other rivers, right? Dost is the archaic form of the verb to do. Keats states that the river Nile covers the thick vegetation near the river rushes with water drops as the river is performing the action of bedew. It can be taken as personification as well. So the poet says, just like the other rivers, river Nile is providing water to vegetation. River Nile is providing water to agriculture, right? That is the basic contribution of any river. If you take Mahaveli, Kalani, Kalu, Alave, all the rivers in Sri Lanka, what is the main contribution of a river? The main contribution is the river will provide water for the day-to-day needs, or else for the vegetation, or else for the agriculture. So River Nile is also very same. That is what the poet says. There is no speciality in that at all, right? That is what the poet says. Now you can understand, like our rivers, just like our rivers, Nile River is also doing the same thing here. Our rivers means like John Keats belong to England. So he may be referring to Thames, right? River Thames, right? He says, just like our rivers, this particular river is also very same. You should not give some kind of special qualities to this particular river. I am sorry, I have done that. The poet accepts the fact that, okay, I have done that in the octave part at the very beginning of the poem, but now I am not going to do that. That is what the poet says, right? So here it can be taken as personification. Green color, which repeats, emphasizes the prosperity of the river. Keats uses a simile like our rivers to compare the river Nile to common rivers in Europe, which diverts its mythical value. Now, Nile River is not special. Nile River does not have these mythical and historical values, or else these historical values. Nile River has been compared to a normal natural river that we see in our day-to-day life. Doesn't matter, Nile River is known to be the longest river in the world. There is no specialty at all. From this estate part onwards, we can understand there is no specialty at all. So hurry up and write down. We are going to finish this particular poem and we are going to start a new poem. We have been discussing about romantic poetry. Soon after we finish romantic poetry, we will move on to the other poems. We actually started from romantic poetry. Then afterwards, we have two poems under the category of romanticism. Then after that, we will move on to the other poems. Hurry up and finish it off. Right. Okay. We have been discussing about romantic poetry, and we have been discussing about To the Nile by John Keats. So today we started about the sestate part. Now we discussed about the octave part, and today we are going to discuss about the sestate part. In the sestate part, what happens in the poem? The poet says, even though I explained River Nile as something historical, mythical, something very much special, the poet says there is no speciality at all. That is what the poet says. There is no speciality at all. Nile River is just a normal river. So in order to become a normal river, what do you need actually? Basically, you need certain characteristics. Certain characteristics should be there, and those characteristics should be very much similar to the other rivers that we see in our day-to-day life, like Mahavali, Kalani, Kalu, Alave, River Thames. So whatever the rivers that we see in our day-to-day life, right? So the poet says, just like the other rivers, Nile River is also providing water in order to do all the agricultural work or else for the vegetation. That is what the poet says, right? So as a result of that, there is no specialty at all, right? I don't see, right? Right. So that is what the poet tries to explain the fact, right? So here it is actually mentioned like that. So yes, this is an ode to a nightingale, and To the Nile can be also taken as an ode. So ode is an addressing poem. It can be negative or positive. There is no argument Anuti in literature that ode should be a positive one. Now, since because you have William Blake to the Evening Skies as a positive poem, it doesn't mean that odes should be always positive. So here, this particular ode to the Nile by John Keats does not blame anyone. John Keats actually explains about the River Nile in two different perspectives, right? So don't think that the ode should be always, something very much positive, right? Here the poet is not critical. Don't misunderstand. Here the poet says whatever the beliefs that people have. Now, some people have certain mythical, mystical features over certain things, and they try to give some kind of mythical value to that, mystical value to that. That is not only for the River Nile, but also there are so many things in the world. As human beings, we add certain supernatural qualities, right? There are certain supernatural qualities. Now, as an example, most of the Buddhists, they believe that in Ruwanveli Mahasaya, where you can see a lot of supernatural things. That is actually a belief that people have, right? Not only in Ruwanveli Saya, even there are certain Buddhist places, right? Even even certain Catholics also, they believe that there are certain churches that they believe certain supernatural things can occur, right? So this is a belief. So just like that, right? John Keats also had some kind of a belief. He thought that Nile River is special from the stories that he has heard from the mythical, mystical, historical stories and legends that he has heard. So he thought that Nile River is special, and later he realized that there is no specialty in Nile River. So it is not a criticism, Buddha. Don't misunderstand. The poet is not going to criticize River Nile. The poet is actually addressing the River Nile. On the other hand, as readers, we can understand this addressing is done to the River Nile in order to explain the readers, in order to explain the general public. Though you think that Nile River is something special, if you are under the impression that Nile River is something special, according to my opinion, there is no speciality at all. That is what the poet tries to say. So don't think that the poet is criticizing River Nile. There is no point of criticizing a Nile, criticizing a river, because at the end of the day, nothing will happen. You can understand that, right? You can criticize a human being and you can get some kind of reaction to that, right? But criticizing a river won't work. So it is not a criticism. Don't misunderstand. You have misunderstood. The poet says the reality according to his perspective, providing proper evidence. Yeah, he says, okay, all the rivers are actually providing water for the vegetation and agriculture. Nile River is also doing the same. So I don't see any speciality. Though I said that Nile River is special, in the octave part, the poet says, now I don't think it is special. The reasons are given, right? The most interesting fact is the reasons are given. This is what you have to highlight. All the reasons are given. This is why I am telling you Nile River is not special. This is why I am telling you this is not a special river. All the explanations are given, right? So the first explanation, the first argument is the poet says Nile River is not special because, right, all the rivers are doing the same thing, right, providing water, and Nile River is also doing the same thing, right? So as a result of that, I don't think Nile River is special. So he gives 4 reasons actually, yeah. In number, he gives 4 reasons. This is the reason number 1. The reason number 1 is all the rivers are actually providing water for vegetation. All the rivers are providing water to do all the agricultural work. So Nile River is also very same. Just like our rivers. Even our rivers are doing the same thing. River Thames, right? They doing the same thing. And Nile River is also doing the same thing. There is no speciality. This is what he tried to highlight, right? I hope you have understood. Then we will move on to the other characteristics, right? What are the other characteristics that the poet tries to explain? Even Nile River is also very same. Just like the other rivers, Nile River is also very same. The second one is, and dost state the pleasant sunrise, green isles hast thou too. So furthermore, the poet says, the simile extends, and the poet says, similar to the common rivers in Europe. Now you can understand, right? Nile River is not special. Though it is the longest river in the world, according to the poet, it is not special. Where the poet says, the simile extends, and the poet says, similar to the common rivers in Europe, the river Nile too enjoys the sunrise. All the rivers in the world, they enjoy the sunrise, right? So Nile River cannot be some kind of a special thing. So Nile River is also a river. At the end of the day, it also enjoys the sunrise, right? So this is what the poet tries to explain. This is not a criticism. Please don't misunderstand. The Nile River is not criticized. The poet is not actually criticizing Nile River. The poet says the reality and fantasy. In the octave part, we can see the fantasy. In the sestate part, we can see the reality. This is what you have to understand. Or else you will come to a wrong conclusion that the poet is criticizing Nile River just like Anudhi. That is not going to happen. Thank you, Anudhi, for asking that question. There is no criticism at all, right? Addressing poems, they don't criticize anyone. If you take Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to a Grecian Urn, if you take other poems by John Keats, you will realize that he is not going to criticize anything. It is about actually reality and fantasy. If you refer to odes by John Keats, you will realize that it's all about reality and fantasy. Because I told you, John Keats died at the age of 24. He suffocated from tuberculosis. So he always wanted to escape from his physical life, physical pain. He was suffering at that time. He wrote poetry in order to escape. He wanted to escape from his physical problems, his physical weaknesses, his physical pain. That is why he wrote poetry. He did not write poetry in order to enlighten the readers. He did not write poetry to enjoy his writing career. He did not do like that. His main intention is to give some kind of a freedom to his suffocative life. That is why he wrote poetry. If you go through almost all the poems from John Keats, you can realize this reality. Don't misunderstand. The river performing the action of tasting is personification. So we know that river is inanimate. The river cannot taste something just like us. The river doesn't have a tongue or something, right? So it is actually personification. Personification, the comparison extends. The Keats mentions that like common rivers in Europe, Nile has islands. So this is the third common characteristic. What is the first common characteristic? All the rivers are actually providing water for agriculture. Nile River also doing the same. Second one, almost all the rivers are actually enjoying the pleasant sunrise. Nile River is also doing the same thing. Third one, almost all the rivers, common rivers, they have islands. They have islands, right? And Nile River is also the same, right? So there are 3 common characteristics. These are the 3 things that you have to remember. Octave part discusses about the fantasy of Nile River. Sestate part discusses about the reality of Nile River. If you can remember like this, you can very easily answer the questions. Octave part discusses about the fantasy. Fantasy is actually created using mythical, mystical, historical features related to the river Nile, using hyperbole, using metaphor, right? Son of the old moon mountain, chief of the pyramid and crocodile, sort of the nurse of the SWAT nations, right? Likewise, lot of metaphors, lot of similes, lot of personification and hyperbole have been used in order to describe the fantasy of the river Nile. And soon after that, what does the poet do? The poet comes to the sestate part, or else the last 6 lines. There, the poet discusses about the reality of the river Nile. Furthermore, the last explanation is given about the river Nile, where the poet tries to enhance the knowledge, or else the poet tries to address the intelligent audience like this. and to the sea as happily dost haste. Finally, all the rivers in this world, doesn't matter what is the country, it can be Mahaveli, Kalani, Kalu, Walave, Thames, or whatever the rivers. At the end of the day, what happens to all the rivers? At the end of the day, all the rivers will go to the sea, right? The last destination, what is the last destination of any river in this world? At the end of the day, all the rivers will go to the ocean. So same thing will happen to the river Nile. Now, can you understand? In the sestate part, you have to pay your attention for four important things, right? In the sestate part, the poet is comparing river Nile to the other rivers, right? The poet tries to explain the fact that there is no specialty at all when it comes to river Nile. All the rivers are doing the same thing. All the rivers in the world, they are actually providing water in order to meet the green vegetation. Nile River is also doing the same thing. All the rivers in this world, they enjoy the pleasant sunrise. Nile River is also doing the same thing. All the rivers in this world, they have islands. Nile River is also having a lot of islands. Finally, all the rivers will go to the ocean at the end of the day, right, as their final destination. And Nile River is also very same. Doesn't matter, Nile River is the longest river in the world. At the end of the day, right, it will also go to the same destination. So now you can understand what do you mean by fantasy and what do you mean by the reality, right? So this is what the poet says when it comes to this particular poem. John Keats represents actually second generation of romantic poets. He clearly explains the fact that there is a big difference between fantasy and reality. If you take almost all the poems, if you take almost all the poems written by John Keats or to a Grecian nun or to a Nightingale, right? If you take almost all the poems, you will realize that he discusses about the fantasy and reality. The reality is he is a patient. He is suffering from tuberculosis, right? At that time period, he did not find any medicine. He lost his mother, father, his brother due to tuberculosis, and even his girlfriend did not want to continue the relationship with him because of this particular disease. So he was mentally fallen, right? He didn't have any options in his life. The only remedy that he received at that time period is poetry, where he says he used his poetic wings to fly away from this particular world. So remember about these things, about these particular writers, right? So you can mention these things when it comes to your introductory paragraph, right? John Keats never wanted to enlighten the readers. John Keats never wanted to enlighten the society. He always wrote poetry for his personal happiness. He wanted to escape from his personal problems. What is the personal problem? His sickness. He suffocated from tuberculosis. Hurry up and write down. So today we are going to discuss more about romantic poetry, and we finished the previous explanation. So we are going to discuss more about this particular topic. As I told you, we have two poems under the category of romantic poetry, right? We discussed about To the Nile by John Keats, and before going to the other poem, I thought of giving some kind of idea for you. What do you mean by romantic poetry? Because most of the students, they don't have a clear idea what do you mean by romantic poetry. So I thought of giving certain characteristics about romantic poetry. These characteristics will be very much important for you when you are writing answers. So let's pay our attention to romantic poetry. What do you mean by romanticism? A movement in art and literature in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is actually movement actually started in the 18th and 19th centuries. It is considered as literature depicting emotional matter in an imaginative form. So there are certain points that you have to highlight. In romantic movement, my dear students, we actually represent literature in imaginative form, emotional and imaginative form. So these two words are very much important. Please make sure to highlight that, right? I hope you guys can see the screen. So here I have given imaginative form, right? Emotional and imaginative form. So basically, these are the two words that you have to highlight. So romantic period actually started during the 18th and 19th centuries, right? So that part also you have to highlight, right? A movement in art and literature in the 18th and the 19th century. So this is what you have to highlight, right? I hope you guys have completed the note. We will move on to the next part. Right. So make sure to remember romantic poetry. Romantic era actually started in the 18th and 19th centuries. In romantic era, we are discussing about emotional matter in an imaginative form. So the word of imagination is something very much important when we discuss about romantic poetry. Don't forget about that. Always make sure to remember the era of romanticism, right? Romanticism can be identified as a very important era when it comes to English literature. So when we discuss about romanticism, we discuss about the emotional matter, depicting emotional matter through imaginative form, right? So imagination plays a key role. Right. So then we will discuss what are the other important characteristics that we have to pay our attention when it comes to romantic poetry, right? Basically, when you take romantic poetry, there are certain key characteristics that you have to pay your attention. Characteristics of the literature of romanticism include subjectivity. Under that, number one, romantic poets, they were very much subjective. What do you mean by subjectivity? Subjective poetry is a kind of poetry in which the poet goes into himself and finds his inspiration from his own experiences. Now, previously we discussed about John Keats. John Keats can be taken as the ideal example for subjectivity. I told you, John Keats did not want to inspire any reader. John Keats did not want to enlighten any reader. John Keats wrote poems for his personal happiness, his personal problems. He addressed his personal problems. So it is very much subjective. Can you understand? Subjective refers to the poet goes to himself and finds his inspiration from his own experiences. This is what we call subjectivity, right? So his personal experience will be depicted in that particular poem. So this is what you have to pay your attention. That is what we call subjectivity. Very much subjective. So most of the poets, they wrote about their personal experiences, right? So the best example can be taken as John Keats because he is there in our syllabus. Instead of writing about religion, instead of writing about politics, instead of writing about any other aspects, he actually used nature, right? He actually used nature, certain incidents, certain experiences related to nature in order to escape from his personal suffocation. That is what we call subjective, very much personal. He wrote about his personal experiences, very much subjective. So this is what we call subjective. So when we discuss about romantic poetry, number one, make sure to understand subjectivity plays a key role. Subjectivity plays a key role, right? Subjective poetry is a kind of poetry in which the poet goes into himself and finds his inspiration from his own experiences. Rather than taking experiences from other people, most of the romantic poets, including William Blake, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and when we have Lord Byron, William Wordsworth, John Keats, if you refer to all these poets, you can understand they used their own experiences, right? Their affairs, their relationships, their illnesses. Now, if you take John Keats, he wrote about his illness, their supernatural ideas, right? So these are the things that we have to pay our attention when it comes to romantic poetry. The first characteristic that you can realize in romantic poetry is subjectivity. What are the other characteristics? Another important characteristic that you have to pay your attention here is emotion and imagination. These two also can be taken as key features when it comes to romantic poetry. You have Elizabethan poetry, you have Victorian poetry, and you have romantic poetry, post-colonial poetry, Sri Lankan poetry, American poetry, Indian poetry. Likewise, you have different genres. You have different genres in your syllabus, right? If you go through your syllabus, you will understand different types of genres will be there. So today we are discussing about romanticism. Who are the poets that we have under this category in our O-level syllabus? John Keats and William Blake, right? They are the ones who we are discussing. After that, we are referring to another genre. So they are the ones that we have to pay our attention. So under the romantic category, another key feature, apart from subjectivity, another key feature that you have to pay your attention is emotion and imagination. In romantic poetry, reason and intellect were subdued and imagination and emotions and passion took their place. So in romantic poetry, we do not talk about reason, intellect, and logical aspects. We don't pay our attention towards logical things. We do not discuss about logical, rational, intellectual things, right? So we discuss about them under the category of metaphysical poetry, right? Metaphysical poetry. We have a different genre, but in your syllabus, we don't have metaphysical poetry, right? Beyond the physics, beyond the physical aspects. That is what we call metaphysical. Metaphysical means beyond the physical aspects. So we have a different genre for that, or else we can discuss about neoclassical poetry, but you don't have to go that much far. I'm just trying to explain you in romantic poetry, we don't give any value when it comes to intellectual things, when it comes to rational things, when it comes to logical things. There is no logic, there is no rational, there is no intelligence that the poet tries to actually uphold when it comes to this kind of poetry. We always discuss about the imagination. Imagination plays a key role, my dear students, and emotions. Romantic poets always try to explain about the beauty of the environment, about the beauty of the certain experiences that they had. They never wanted to argue with someone. They never came with logical arguments, right? They never came with rational arguments, right? So that is why we say that William Blake can be taken as a radical poet. When all the other poets wrote about imagination and emotions, William Blake actually wrote about social criticism, right? Last week, a student actually asked that question, sir, why William Blake is known to be a radical poet, though he takes under the category of romantic poetry? That is a very good question. William Blake is known as a radical poet because he followed a different path. Almost all the romantic poets, they wrote about subjectivity. They wrote about emotions. They wrote about imagination. Even William Blake also did the same thing. Don't forget, we are going to discuss about William Blake now, To the Evening Star by William Blake. So William Blake also wrote about beauty of the environment, right? To the Evening Star is belong to nature. So in that particular poem, we discuss about the beauty of nature, service of nature. On the other hand, William Blake did not stop from there, right? Percy Bysshe Shelley, he stopped from emotions and imagination, right? John Keats, he stopped from there. He did not take a radical path, right? William Wordsworth, he discussed about the beauty and the pastoral setting, right? Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he discussed about the supernatural elements, right? But when we take William Blake, he took a radical path. What is the radical part, my dear students? He wrote about the social injustice as well. He saw the problems which actually occurred in the England society, or else in the Victorian society, due to industrialization. What are the major problems that he experienced, right? Child exploitation, right? Prostitution, right? Unemployment, right? Environmental pollution, right? Moral degradation. So these are the things he highlighted. So he did not stop from emotion and imagination. He also wrote about social injustice. If you take poems like London, Chimney Sweepers, you will realize, you have to read these poems, right? Then you will realize that even though William Blake comes under the category of romanticism, he wrote about social problems as well. He is the only poet out of all the poets. Who are the poets under the romantic category? William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron, right? If you take all these poets, you can understand he is the only poet. He is the only poet who wrote about these radical things, right? Social problems, social injustice. That is why William Blake is known to be a radical poet. He's very much radical. Other poets, they did not do like that. John Keats, he didn't do like that. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he didn't do like that. William Wordsworth, he didn't do like that, right? Lord Byron, he didn't do like that. Percy Bysshe Shelley, he didn't do like that, right? Other poets, they did not engage in radical movement, but William Blake, he actually engaged in radical movement. He is a very much, when we take William Blake as a poet, he's a very much religious poet. He believed in Catholicism, right? He's a very much religious poet, but he criticized certain religious entities, certain religious institutions without having any second thoughts. If you read The Chimney Sweepers, we can clearly understand how he ridicules, how he criticizes about the certain principles, certain actions taken by the church, right? He openly criticizes. He is a very much, ardent Catholic follower, but yet he criticizes the behavior of the modern, the principles and certain laws actually practiced by modern churches and modern priests, right? So that is why we call radical. Being a Catholic, being a follower of Jesus, he actually criticizes certain values. Can you understand? That is radical. Now, being a Buddhist, right? It's very much radical to criticize the certain principles actually followed by certain monks in Sri Lanka. It's not easy. It's not easy, right? A lot of people will say that I am doing something wrong. It's not easy, but William Blake did that. That is what we call a radical poet. So emotion and imagination plays a key role when it comes to romantic poetry. Don't forget about that part as well. Then we discuss about simplicity. Now I explained you two things under the category of romantic poetry: subjectivity, personal experiences. Then I discussed about emotions and imagination. Apart from intellectual knowledge, we always paid our attention towards, right, emotions and imagination. Then we discuss about simplicity. Very simple experiences, right? Anybody can understand. Instead of artificial mode of expression of classical poets, we have natural diction and spontaneous way of expressing thoughts in romantic poetry. Most of the romantic poets, they took certain natural spontaneous incidents or spontaneous places, natural places that we can all identify, all can experience in our day-to-day environment. The best example is to the Nile. Everybody knows about River Nile, right? Even though you have not seen River Nile, you have heard about River Nile, right? To the Evening Star by William Blake, we have heard about To the Evening Star, the goddess Venus, right? We have heard about that. We have seen that evening star in the night sky, right? So this is a very common incident. So these common incidents were taken into consideration by the romantic poet. So this is what we call simplicity. Language is very much simple. Anybody can understand, even though they have used archaic language. It's not that much difficult. We can understand, right? And romantic poets believe in the simplicity in their style. They want to write something in a very simple manner where anybody can understand. At the same time, they took most of the natural elements. They can be rivers, they can be mountains, or else certain natural elements like sun, moon, stars, something like that. They took all these things as their experiences, and then they wrote their poetry, they wrote their addressing poems or any other types of poetry accordingly, right? So this is also another feature. So basically, my dear students, we discussed about three things actually. We discussed about the subjectivity, we discussed about the simplicity, and we discussed about emotions and imagination. These are the key factors, key characteristics that a student should understand when it comes to romantic poetry. Puta, you have to understand poems by their era. I am pretty sure in your schools, they have not taught this. When you are doing literature as a subject, you should exactly know who is the poet, what is the era, why that era is important. Now you know that why William Blake is known to be a radical poet, right? Now you know why William Blake is known to be a radical poet. You know it. Now you can understand why he is known to be a radical poet, right? So if somebody asks you why William Blake is known to be a radical poet, you should give answer, right? Why William Blake comes under the category of romantic poetry, you have to give answers, right? So you have to understand poetry with the genres, right? With the time periods, with the relevance of their time periods and their ideas, right? Their experiences. These are the things that you have to highlight. So please write down. Hurry up, pass me a message. We discussed about so many aspects related to romantic poetry, and I am moving to William Blake to the Evening Star, the second poem in your syllabus. This will be a great chance to revise all the poems that you have already studied in grade 10, right? So it's a great chance. Make sure to take the maximum advantage of that. Hurry up. Make sure to complete your notes. Please pass me a message if you have finished. Hurry up. Right, we will move on to the next part. This is the most important part. Please make sure to write down, then I will explain. This is the most important key feature when it comes to romantic poetry. We discussed about subjectivity. We discussed about emotions and imagination. We discussed about simplicity. And this is the most important key feature when it comes to romantic poetry. Most important one, right? So hurry up and write down. Make sure to highlight certain points. Hurry up. Okay, I hope that you guys have finished. Let's discuss the key feature in romantic poetry. As you know, when we discuss about romanticism, apart from subjectivity, simplicity, emotions, and imaginations, the key feature that you all have to pay your attention is love of and worship of nature. Romanticism refers to nature. In simple words, it refers to nature. Most of the romantic poets, even though they had their personal attributes, right, they used nature. Sometimes they took certain element from nature and they discussed about their problem. Now, as an example, if you take John Keats, I explained you, he suffocated from tuberculosis. It is kind of a physical illness. So in order to escape from his personal problem, he actually used a nightingale, right, an element of nature. And he described about the nightingale, and he described what kind of happiness that actually engaged or enjoyed by the nightingale, which is not permitted to him when it comes to his life. So he discusses about the fantasy and reality. To the Nile River is actually belong to nature, right? So certain elements are actually taken from the nature in order to explain their problems, in order to explain their experiences, right? So nature plays a very important role when it comes to romanticism. Otherwise, most of you guys think that romantic means the relationship between girl and a boy. That is also actually romanticism. But here, when we discuss about romantic poetry, we discuss about nature, nothing but nature. Romanticism and nature are connected because the artists and philosophers of the romantic period emphasize the glory and beauty of nature and the power of natural world, right? So they discussed about the power of the world, power of natural world, the imagination, right? They did not bother about these social problems like uh, environment pollution or else child exploitation. They did not bother, right? They saw those problems, but they did not bother, right? They did not bother to write about them. So this is the reality. Romanticism and nature are connected because the artists and the philosophers of the romantic period emphasize the glory and beauty of nature and the power of the natural world. Some scholars of romanticism believe that romantics treated nature in an almost religious way. Exactly, yes. Now, if you take William Blake is a priest. He is a Catholic priest, right? But by even though he is a priest, right, he actually challenged, he actually criticized certain principles, certain traditions, certain laws actually uh, followed by certain priests and certain churches, right? When it comes to England, when it comes to Victorian period, he actually challenged it, right? So this is why he is known to be a radical person. And most of the time, he added certain religious Catholic taste to his poems, right? If you take to the Evening Star, where we can find silver dew, right? Silver dew means holy water. And fleeces of our flocks, right? Fleeces of our flocks refers to all the pack animals, right? When it comes to Christianity, they are known to be innocent people, right? Innocent people who live in the society, right? So the poet is actually asking some kind of a blessing from the Evening Star to innocent people who live in the Victorian society, who suffer with poverty and different types of social exploitations, right? So William Blake is such a poet. So he treated the environment in a most religious manner. And the most important key feature that you have to remember when it comes to romantic poetry is that love of and worship of nature. That can be taken as a key aspect. We are moving to our question. Our question is, how do the literary devices handled by the poet in the poem To the Evening Star strengthen the major theme of nature, right? The major theme of nature. So the question is from The Evening Star by William Blake. We have been discussing about romantic poetry. So we are going to discuss how do the literary devices handled by the poet in the poem To the Evening Star strengthen the major theme of nature. So we are going to discuss about the major theme of nature. We have to highlight the literary devices, right? We are not going to highlight any other aspects. So we are going to highlight literary devices. By highlighting literary devices, we are going to discuss how these literary devices are used in order to enhance the nature. Hurry up and write down the question. Let's deal with the target question and let's pay our attention to the plan of the answer. Part 1, introduction to the poet and the poem. Part 2, different types of literary techniques used by the poet to strengthen the beauty and the glory of nature as a romantic poet. Don't forget about that. And part 3, the conclusion. So this is my plan for the answer. I'm going to write my answer according to this plan. Hurry up and write down. We will start with the introductory paragraph. This is my introductory paragraph, so you can write your own paragraph, including the key aspects of this particular poem and the poet as well. William Blake was a 19th century writer and the artist who is regarded as a seminal figure of the Romantic age. His writings have influenced countless writers and artists through the ages. To the Evening Star is an ode to the Venus. Venus is the Roman goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. It is not a sonnet because it does not possess the rhyming scheme. The poet is calling upon her to protect us against the evils of the night and, more importantly, to inspire all that is oppressed during the daytime. Furthermore, the poet successfully illustrates how all the elements of nature can come together to create a beautiful, impeccable, and perfect situation, right? So one by one, we have to address all the literary techniques that we have in the poem, not all actually, at least few, in order to show the beauty of the nature and the grandeur of nature, glory of nature. But before doing that, it is important to give some kind of introduction to the poem and the poet. So I have given that in my first paragraph. From here onwards, I am moving to my second paragraph or else the second part of my particular answer. So our answer, we have already made the plan. So the entire answer will be written according to the plan. This is what we have to practice. So hurry up and write down. Right, we will cover the other aspects of this particular question next week. If you have finished, you can leave the meeting. We will meet next week.